The door hit the wall hard enough that 2 picture frames rattled on their hooks. I looked up from my laptop, still logging into systems. I'd been given access to an hour earlier and saw him for the first time. Mid-20s, expensive suit that didn't quite fit right, and an expression that suggested he'd been waiting his entire life to do what he was about to do. 2 security guards flanked him like borrowed authority. He didn't introduce himself. He pointed at me the way you'd point at a stain that needed removing and said 3 words with absolute certainty. "You're fired. Leave." The office wasn't even unpacked yet. My briefcase sat open on the desk, business cards still in their box, the welcome packet from HR untouched beside my keyboard. I'd been employed for exactly 93 minutes. Around us, new colleagues I hadn't met yet froze at their desks, eyes wide, pretending not to watch while watching everything. One of the security guards stepped forward with a cardboard box, the universal symbol of professional humiliation. The CEO's son, because that's who he was, though he hadn't bothered with that context, leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "My father might have hired you," he said, loud enough for the entire floor to hear, "but I run operations here, and I don't like consultants who think they can walk in and change things. We're done." He made a spinning gesture with his finger, the kind you'd make to hurry along a child. The security guards weren't rough, but they weren't gentle either. Every personal item went into that box under supervision, as if I might steal proprietary information from a company I'd technically been part of for less than 2 hours. My badge was confiscated at the elevator. By the time I reached the parking garage, my hands were shaking. Not from fear or sadness, but from the specific rage that comes from public humiliation by someone who has no idea what they've just done. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, waiting for my hands to steady. Then I opened my briefcase and pulled out the document the CEO's son hadn't known existed. Majority shareholder agreement. My name, 65% ownership. Filed, notarized, legally unbreakable. 6 months earlier, I'd received a phone call I almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end belonged to Marcus Chen, CEO of a mid-sized logistics company I'd consulted for years prior. This call wasn't casual. His company was dying. Not the slow decline that competent leadership can reverse, but the accelerating spiral that ends in bankruptcy filings and liquidation auctions. Client contracts were being terminated. Major partners had walked away. The balance sheet was catastrophic, and the operational inefficiencies were so systemic that standard consulting wouldn't work fast. Enough. He needed capital, expertise, and someone willing to bet their reputation on a company most people had written off. He needed it in 90 days or the doors would close permanently. I spent 2 weeks analyzing everything. The company wasn't fundamentally broken. It had been mismanaged into crisis through outdated systems, poor decisions, and leadership that had stopped adapting years ago. The problems were fixable, but fixing them required resources. The company no longer had an authority that couldn't be blocked by internal politics. I made an offer that would have sounded insane to anyone who hadn't done the analysis. I would inject $2 million of personal capital. I would restructure operations remotely, using my network to secure new contracts and implement new systems. In exchange, I wanted 65% equity ownership with operational control during the transition. Marcus would retain 35% and stay on as CEO, maintaining relationships while I rebuilt the foundation. The lawyers drafted agreements that protected both sides. Everything was filed properly, documented extensively, legally airtight. But we kept the ownership structure quiet, announcing that the company had sold majority. Control would spook remaining clients and nervous employees. Publicly, I was a senior strategic consultant while the real work happened behind the scenes. For 5 months I worked from my home office, never visiting headquarters. I renegotiated contracts, eliminated redundancies, restructured debt, and personally convinced former clients to return. I built new acquisition pipelines, automated manual processes, and systematically addressed every operational inefficiency. By month 4, the company was cash flow positive for the first time in 18 months. By month 5, we'd signed contracts that would stabilize revenue for 3 years. The crisis was over. That's when I scheduled my first physical day in the office. Marcus's son had been absent during the entire crisis. While his father faced bankruptcy, Junior had been traveling through Southeast Asia, posting from beach clubs funded by family money that was evaporating. He'd been copied on emails about bringing in outside help but never read the details or asked questions. By the time he returned, the company was saved. He knew his father had hired some consultant, but he'd never reviewed the agreements or imagined that consultant now owned more of the company than his father did. All he saw was an outsider in what he considered his inheritance. He just hadn't checked whether he had authority to do anything about it. I sat in that parking garage running calculations. I could call Marcus immediately, expose what happened, humiliate his son. But that would be reactive. I needed to decide what I actually wanted. Vindication, control, or to teach a lesson about respect and due diligence. The son's behavior revealed something deeper, a culture of entitlement, a family dynamic where consequences didn't exist, a business where power came from last names rather than competence. The decision crystallized. I wouldn't just correct the firing. I would use my majority ownership to restructure everything, starting with removing people who enabled this toxicity. But first I'd let the son enjoy his victory for exactly 48 hours while lawyers prepared documentation. I wanted him comfortable, confident, telling people what he'd done. I wanted him to feel secure in his power before discovering he'd never had any over the next 2 days. I didn't disappear, I observed. I called trusted contacts still inside, asked careful questions, and discovered the son had been telling everyone he made the decision to clean. House of Dead Weight Consultants. He was taking credit for the turnaround results I'd engineered, positioning himself as the company's savior. He'd moved into the office meant for me, held a meeting where he disparaged outside hires who don't understand our culture, and hinted at firing other employees he saw as threats. Marcus was on a planned 2-week vacation, unreachable, deliberately disconnected to let his son prove himself as future leadership. I also discovered the son had made preliminary contact with a potential acquisition offer. He was planning to sell the company his father built, cash out, and never work again. Each revelation made my course clearer. This wasn't about one bad day. It was about protecting the business, the employees who did nothing wrong, and the CEO who'd trusted his son with operational control, but not with the truth about who actually owned what. On day 3, my lawyers filed notice of an emergency shareholder meeting. As 65% majority owner, I had the legal right to call one. The son received the notice with confusion, then panic as he read documents proving ownership. He tried reaching his father. He called the company's lawyers, who confirmed the shareholder agreement was legitimate and binding. The meeting happened in the main conference room. The son arrived expecting to control the situation, perhaps thinking this was a negotiation he could win with charm or intimidation. I sat at the head of the table, the majority shareholder seat. Senior leadership was present, confused but legally required to attend. I spoke calmly, laying out the timeline, my investment, the turnaround work, the ownership structure. then the firing. Not with emotion, but with facts. I presented documentation of the son's actions over 48 hours, the lies about the turnaround, the plans to sell, the toxic management style. Then came the resolution. Effective immediately, the son was removed from all operational roles. He retained no authority, no office, no company email. He wasn't fired, his father still owned 35%, but he was completely stripped of power. I assumed the role I was originally hired for. Chief Restructuring Officer with operational control. The meeting ended with the son speechless, senior leadership visibly relieved, and me finally sitting in the office I'd earned. Marcus returned from vacation to a drastically changed situation. I met with him privately, explained everything with the same calm documentation used in the board meeting. He was torn, embarrassed by his son's behavior, grateful the company wasn't sold, but facing the reality that his heir apparent was incompetent and destructive. The company stabilized under my leadership. Employees who witnessed the initial firing and subsequent reversal developed fierce loyalty. They'd seen leadership that actually protects competence over nepotism. The son largely disappeared from operations, occasionally appearing at mandatory shareholder meetings, but with zero influence. Some bridges with Marcus remained strained, but professional respect developed. I reflected on the cost. The humiliation of that first day never fully disappeared, and family business dynamics remained complicated. But the alternative was allowing entitlement to destroy something built through actual work. 6 months later, the company was thriving, beyond even the turnaround projections. This story isn't about majority, ownership, or corporate governance. Most people will never be in that specific situation. It's about the moment you realize someone has power over you that they don't actually have, because you hold leverage they haven't bothered to understand. Maybe it's expertise they can't replace, relationships they need, or knowledge they don't possess. Document everything. Understand your actual position, legally, professionally, strategically, before reacting to disrespect. Recognize the difference between positional authority and actual power. Entitlement collapses when it encounters preparation. You don't need majority ownership to refuse to be treated as disposable. You need clarity about your value, the courage to enforce your boundaries, and the patience to let people who underestimate you reveal exactly who they are before you respond. The question isn't whether they can fire you, it's whether they can afford what happens after.